Good morning. It's really good to be here. It's really good to see you all. And if you're gathered with us online or you're in the room, we're so thrilled and excited that you're here. And just if you're new to church or you're new here, just pray and ask that you take a next step, as Pastor Reed just shared a little bit ago. And I'm excited to start this new series, Hope, with you all. And as we get started, I just kind of want to begin by telling you a story that I recently heard on a podcast. And it's a tale of two skydivers, one by the name of Shirley Digert, the other David Hartsock. And so this is not actually them, but this is, for the sake of our purposes, this is two skydivers. And so Shirley, she has a 30-year-old son, and she promised to go skydiving with him as like a birthday gift, right? It's kind of a out-of-the-box thing for her, so she agreed to do that. And so she's going skydiving with her son, who went first. And so she's a student. She's never done this before, so she's with an instructor, and so they're tethered together. And so Shirley is a student, David is the instructor. And they're gliding down, seemingly things are going well. I don't know, I'm afraid of heights, so I assume it was going well. But they're gliding down, it's nice and smooth. And then David deploys the primary chute, which I don't know from experience, but I've heard is supposed to be smooth. But that was not the case. Instead, it felt like they got hit by a brick wall, and they began spinning out dizzily, almost flat with the ground, which is not what you're supposed to do. And he looked up and he sees that the canopy is not all the way inflated. In fact, the canopy has gotten tangled with the harness on its release, and it's just like hopelessly tangled, okay? So they're lying out, flying at dizzying speed. It's not looking good. But the thing is, you have a primary chute and you have a reserve chute for just such occasion as this. And so he's got to cut away the primary chute in order to get to the reserve chute. But when he goes to do that, he realizes that the way it's twisted, it's like so twisted with the harness that to cut away the actual chute is going to cut away the harness as well, which is not a good idea. And they hit 3,000 feet. And they just can't wait any longer. If they're going to pull the reserve chute, now is the time to make that happen. So they do, hoping for the best, hoping that somehow everything would magically be fixed and the reserve chute would pop out perfectly and they would be all right. So they pull the reserve chute and nothing fixes itself. It's also half inflated. It's a jarbled mess, and they are coming in for a catastrophic finish. And from the ground, Shirley's sons and her husband watch in horror as she's just plummeting toward the ground, preparing for a catastrophic landing. The situation was incredibly hopeless in that moment. And we'll come back to that story at the very end. I promise we will. Sorry about that. There's a lot of tension, so. And maybe when you look at your world, and you look at our world, and you look at your life, maybe hopeless is the descripting word for you. Maybe that's how you describe your situation. Maybe you feel like when you look at everything going on, it's headed towards a catastrophic finish. Everything feels a bit broken in life. And you just look at everything you see in the news, everything you see in media, and you look towards the 2020 elections, which are going to be divisive and controversial, no matter who you are, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. And then all you hear is about an uncertain economy. And even when things look pretty good, what you hear is, oh, it's a bubble. Get ready. It'll pop. It's a bubble. It's a bubble. Nothing's sure. Nothing's hopeful. Nobody's looking on the bright side. And then parents trying to figure out what schools will look like. We have an idea of what they look like now. What will they look like in 2 months? What will they look like a year from now? And then when we think about our kids, maybe this is you, you're thinking, how will our kids make it in a world that doesn't look that great right now and gives no indication that it's going to get better in the near future? And I think of my daughter, and I'm like, man, what will her teenage years be like in this reality? I have no idea. But I think about it, and I'm not filled with hope. See, the thing is, and there's this tension because the world we look at, it's kind of mess, it's kind of mangled. And yet, when we look at these things, the tension is, it feels hopeless, but we want to have hope. We want to experience hope, but when the bottom falls out of our world and falls out of life again and again, this is the tense question. How do I have hope in a hopelessly broken world? How do I have hope in a hopelessly broken world? This is a time of life, this is a season in our world, and maybe in your life, where we just felt like hope is something we needed. And we wanted, our heart as a teaching team is to be able to share that. So we made it the topic of our next 5-week series. And you know we did that because we called it Hope, so there you go. And in this series, I want to give you a working definition for it. No matter the communicator that comes up here, we're all going to kind of build on this, but this is our baseline working definition. Here it is. Hope is an expectation centered in a person or thing that will produce a better future. So it's an expectation centered in a person or thing, and that person or thing will produce a better future in our minds. Those are some of the key elements of hope, no matter what it's in, no matter who you are. So, backing it up and just thinking of this, there are a lot of places we can center hope. Where do you find yourself centering hope? It's an extra question. Because I think sometimes we can place our hope in things or in people that we never intended to. We don't realize we're doing it. But think about it this way for a moment. The things that we can put our hope in are varied, and they're very different. Let me illustrate. Perhaps you think that if I just find the right job, if I just have the right career, think about if you can go back. If you're in your 20s, great. If you're not in your 20s, go back to that first kind of career job that you had. When you first set out on your own, the expectation, the hope of it all, that's like, this is it. This is going to be it. Your first career job. This is what adulthood feels like. My parents have been telling me to do this for years. And you get that first job and you're like, yes, there's a lot of joy associated with that. And then as you progress in the job, maybe you put more and more stock and trust in it, confidence in it, hope, we'd even say, even though you may not register it on that level. But at some point, it kind of progresses from almost kind of like this joy. You realize this is not perfect. All right, no job is perfect. This is not all there is. And so you invest a little bit of yourself because at some point it crosses over into need and you're like, well, this isn't the perfect job, but it's okay. There's some things that are great. There's some things that are wrong. But, man, I got mouths to feed. I got bills to pay. And so there's a little bit more. I'm really scared of heights. So this is terrifying. So you put a little more of your hope in this. You put a little more of your stock, and it's a need. And at some point, for a lot of us, there's that question of identity. When people say, how are you? And you start talking about how things are going at work. That may be a key indicator that some of your identity is invested in this. And so you put more confidence, more trust in that career, in that job. And then at some point, maybe you get to the end of it all. Goodness, this is terrifying. And you realize just how shaky and uncertain the whole thing is. Perhaps you're feeling really scared at the top, all alone. But you're realizing that you lost the job, the contract didn't get renewed, you were terminated, or you just retired, and you're left asking the question, who am I now? Who am I now? So maybe at some point you realize that maybe this isn't your thing, because maybe you've built your hope, and maybe you've centered it someplace else. Maybe you've centered it on marriage. If I could just get married, that would make everything better. If I could just get married, that'd make everything better. And you're kind of dating, and there's that like fun romantic thing. Everything's romantic when you're dating. And then you get into the first year of marriage, and you're like, okay, this is still really fun. Then you get into year 7, and you're thinking like, this is tougher. But I made a commitment. There's still love there, but it's tougher. If you keep building hope and investing in this relationship, there are some times where you get to the end of it, and you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I said, till death do us part, but they didn't mean it. Or, the way of all things, someone passes. That relationship is over in this world. And if you realize that you're at the top and you've invested all your hope in this, it's shaky. Maybe marriage, maybe relationships aren't your thing. Maybe it's your kids. Man, your kids. And maybe it's, the thought of having kids is something you really want to experience. You really want to experience parenthood. If I could just experience parenthood, man, I want to experience that love. I want someone to love me that way, whatever it may be. But you have kids, and then they're toddlers, and you're like, okay, this is really hard. There's so many sacrifices of my life and all these areas of my life to make this work. but there's a lot of joy there too. And then they get to be teens, which I'm just entering with my kids, and I've heard that it gets harder, which is good. Thank you for that. But they're teens, and so when you think about raising teenagers, it's kind of like you see there's tough stuff. Don't get me wrong, but there's so much future potential, and we can find ourselves going after their future, pushing them forward. The things we were never able to do, we're able to put our hope in what they'll be able to do. We invest our whole worlds and our whole life, and at some point, as is the way, they end up being adults and they move out. It's normal. It's good. And you may have a great relationship or you may not, but you're left asking the question, what do I do now? And if your whole world, if all of your hope is based in this, any of these things, and if it's not one of these things, it's something else, where is your hope centered? Because at the top is lonely. At the top is shaky, scary, hopeless, and at some point, with all the things that we put our hope in, and you may not even, that's the thing, you may not even realize that you're doing it until you get to the top of that ladder and realize that the bottom has fallen out. And then you realize how much hope, how much stock you had placed in that person, that thing, that relationship. And if you experience hopelessness at the top of these things all too often, at some point it switches from hopelessness and you begin to expect hopelessness. You get exhausted. Nothing matters. Nothing's ever getting better. Nothing's ever going to change. You stop hoping. You stop trusting. You stop believing. And my friends, I believe that's where cynicism grows. So where do you center your hope? It's a deeper question than it sounds. And if there's all this potential to center my hope on the wrong thing or the thing that will leave me alone and scared at the top, how do I have hope in a hopelessly broken world then? Where do I center my hope? And the Apostle Paul responded to this really, really well. And part of his story is he is a dude that climbed the ladder just like some of us are prone to do. Only the ladder he climbed was one of leadership and reputation and authority, all invested in following the Jewish law, and that meant denying Jesus. And he's at the top, except he meets the risen Jesus Christ face to face. And there's this oh no moment, because he realized his whole ladder, he's at the top, and he's facing Jesus. And he realized something was off. The ladder he had built could not stand. The center was falling apart. So he begins to follow Jesus, and it changes his whole world. He's transformed. He lets that ladder go. He begins to follow Jesus. He changes his name to Paul. He starts planting churches all over the world at that time. And then he will write letters to these churches to encourage, sometimes to confront. And that's a big part of what he does. That's the ministry God has for him. And in one of the letters that he writes, it's a letter to the church in Rome. He speaks to hope, and here's what he says in Romans 8:18. That's where we're going to be. Romans 8:18, working through 28 today. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. I reckon, I calculate, I count, right? That our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. In other words, I'm counting up what I have to look forward to and what I'm experiencing now, and when I equate the two, there's just no comparison. What's out there, what's next for me is better. And then he continues, and he starts talking about our hopeless world a little bit. He says, for the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. That means, and this I think is pretty profound, because if we're waiting for the children of God to be revealed, I just want to share this with you. That some of you may have grown up or maybe have heard or exposed to at some point in life that every single person born is a child of God. And what this passage says, and John wrote this, or actually Paul wrote this, but John speaks to it. He's an eyewitness of Jesus. And basically, what the Bible communicates is that's just not the case. That not everybody born is a child of God, because if they have to be revealed, then not everybody is initially. But an eyewitness to Jesus' life, John, he says that all that receive him, who believe in his name, he gives them the right to become children of God. So it's a decision that you and I have to make. And what this also lets us know is that Paul's writing this hope for followers of Jesus. And so I just want to say, if you're not a follower of Jesus, kind of consider this a moment. It's like we're all gathered at a family table and you've been invited in. You get to kind of hear what's going on behind the scenes. And so I just hope it's encouraging. This thing that we talk about called the Christian faith, Christianity, just take a listen. See if there's any of these promises, any of this hope that's appealing to you, and if you want to take hold of it. And Paul continues to share why none of our ladders in life work. He says, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it in hope. All right, so that means just all creation is frustrated. Everything that is created, everything that's made, people, creatures, yada, 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 everything is frustrated to some extent. And then he says why? That the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. The key phrase, bondage of decay, means that everything is fallen apart. Right? Things break down. Life breaks down. Old age happens. Sickness happens. Death happens. I have heard it said that the mortality rate for life is 100%. You know the bondage of decay. When you look in the mirror, maybe over the years, you see the bondage of decay. My brother is younger than me by a few years, but he is 6'5". He got all the height. He got all the genetic prowess. My whole life, my younger brother's been like faster, stronger, taller than me. But here's the other thing. He's so tall that you can't often see the top of his head, but I saw a picture on Facebook where he's like bent over with his kids. Dude's got a huge bald spot. And I'm like, you can be 6'5", man, but I got all my hair, you know? I hope he's not watching this. It's like, when I look at my beard and I see gray hairs, I'm like, that's new, bondage of decay. I just need to start calling it like bondage of decay, right in the mirror. Right? And science explains this all as just like an accumulation of a lifetime of damage to our DNA. Okay, that makes sense. It's observable. And yet, what the Bible communicates is a big story that helps unlock the spiritual dimension to bondage of decay. That's the story, right? From the beginning, that when mankind, that first story of Adam and Eve, God had given them a perfect standard, and they broke that. They didn't meet up to that standard, and sin entered the world. All sin is it's missed the mark. Where's God's standard, here's what they're doing, and it's different. It's disconnected. And from the moment that happened, sin entered the world, and sin brought that brokenness that contaminated everything. And now everything is trapped in that cycle of decay. It's the spiritual dimension to what we observe in life. Everything's breaking down. Creation, our bodies, our ecosystem, the institutions and systems that we build with our hands, our relationships, everything's breaking down. The Bible views sin as a disease that's toxic and it's fatal. And it means all living things die. Super depressing. So we're not going to end the message here. But to some extent, that reality really explains why none of our ladders work. It also explains why probably our ladders are a bad idea, because at some point, everything is breaking down. It's all falling apart. We were joking about this earlier, but it's like if I step up on this ladder and I get to the top step, there was last night when I did this for the first time, there was a moment in my mind, I was like, what if the top step breaks? I was like, and I get hurt, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's this reality of just everything, all the ladders that we can build are not a good idea because everything is falling apart. And then Paul says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And we think about that. It's like my wife has had 4 kids and I've been there for all of them. And so I know there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of groaning and yelling. And when we think about that, it's like, oh, those things are rough, but there's always that joy on the other side. But let's put what Paul says in the context of his time. And that's that when women gave birth, it wasn't a for sure thing. Medicine wasn't as developed. There's a high mortality rate. So this is a cry of life or death. And I just want to say it is okay to groan in life. In fact, the same word used here and just a few verses, Paul will say that for you, follower of Jesus, the Spirit of the living God within you, when you don't know what to say, will groan like that on your behalf. That's nuts. And that means God's okay with groaning. Because everything's breaking down. Everything's falling apart. If you and I are going to have any kind of hope, we got to be able to see a better future, and we got to figure out where to center that future on. And this is where Paul speaks to that better future. He says this: we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. And this is huge. In the face of all this brokenness, and the face of this bondage and decay, and the face of impending cynicism, it says this, that the Spirit within us assures us that we are indeed children of the living God, and all of that hopelessness. You've been saved, you've been adopted, you've been brought into that relationship. So you put your hope in a better future when in this life you turn to God as your Father. That's what that adoption to sonship means. Turning to God as your Father. And I'll ask you this question, and you have to think about it. When you think of God, is He your Father or is He your boss? Really, I mean, think about it. Not what you think, but like what actually matters in your heart. What do you act out on? Is He your boss or your Father? And how do you think He really feels about you? Because if He's a boss, then the relationship at some level is always going to be transactional. It's always going to be services in exchange for wages and benefits. In other words, if I do His thing, if I do the good thing, then I get the good thing. And if that's the relationship, I'm telling you, this groaning, this suffering, this pain, the hopeless bondage, decay, broken world that's falling apart, you don't know what to do with it. Because when it impacts you, if it's all based upon transactional love, which is no love at all, then in the back of your mind when that stuff happens, you're thinking, I don't deserve this. This is not what's due me. And you don't have a place for it. It's not a criticism. But that's where giving up is really easy. That's where cynicism grows, if it's all transactional. But if you turn to Him as Father, see, in the paragraph before this, just the part of the letter before this, Paul says something. He says, when we go to God, we have the ability to call Him Abba, Father. In other words, literally, Daddy. It may feel awkward calling God Daddy, but that's what Paul invites us to. That's the relationship. That's what's intended. Turn to God as a good Father. And it's not transactional. It's based on unconditional love. I have 2 boys. My youngest is 6 months, but my second youngest, my third kid. Okay, here we go. His name's Levi. He's 2.5. He is potty training right now, which is code for peeing his pants 6 times a day. It's not going great. It's terrible. If he were an employee, I would fire him. Because you can't pee your pants at work. But he's not. Like, it's not based on anything he's done. I don't love him because of what he does for me. I love him because he's my kid. And I want him to approach me like that. It's a relationship based on unconditional love and nothing he can do. See, a boss will get rid of employees that mess up. But when parents have a kid that messes up, it a lot of times focuses our love and helping them, being concerned for them, figuring out how to work with them. On the other side of being a dad, I have learned a lot about God that I just couldn't have learned in any other experiential way. But do you approach God as a boss or a father? And I want to invite you to turn to Him as Father. Because I think it makes it easier to hope in this world. And the other thing Paul says is the redemption of our bodies. And I'll just share this. It means that it means ransomed from bondage. It means set free. It means sin and death no longer. That bondage of decay is broken. And you're going to get a new body with no pain, no aging, no death. And Paul says we were given this hope when we were saved. Again, the adoption of sons, the redemption of bodies. If we already have something, we don't need to hope for it. That makes sense, because you see it. But if we look forward to something we don't have yet, we must wait patiently and confidently. But I'll just say this. Waiting patiently and confidently is really hard when everything feels really broken around you. I mean, we say it, we look forward to that thing, but everything around us is super broken on a practical level. And I just want to encourage you to find hope, what Paul kind of begins to transition this segment with. And he makes this kind of promise that I think is really, really neat. And find hope in what he says here. He says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And I think there's a life story, a woman named Elizabeth Elliot, and her story, I think, speaks to the reality and the truth of this verse. And this is a little bit of her story. And she shared this with a group of college students many years ago. I was not there. It was many, many years ago. But what she shared was that, if you don't know anything about her, she was married to a man named Jim Elliot, who was one of 5 missionaries that went into this, to reach this tribe and reach out and share the good news of Jesus with the tribe in Ecuador that was known to be really brutal, really violent, and opposed to outsiders. But they felt a calling from God to do that. So Elizabeth, Jim, and all these families, they get together, and she talks about the night before they went out to make first contact. They sang a powerful hymn that ended with these words, "We rest on thee, our shield and our defender." And then the very next day, her husband and those other men made first contact and were speared to death. What? But her story gets a little crazier from there. Rather than just retreat, I think hoping in this verse, hoping in something that is after this, hoping in something eternal, Elizabeth Elliot took her toddler daughter and her sister-in-law, her husband's sister, and they went out and they lived with the same tribe that killed her husband. And they lived there for 5 years, and they did a lot of good work. They shared a lot of good news. They built a lot of key relationships. And you're thinking, who would do that? Who would do that? Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone take that risk? Well, I think Jim Elliot was willing to do what he did because of his hope in this verse. And I think Elizabeth was willing to do what she did because of her hope in this verse. Because of a hope that God is in control. Because of an eternal perspective. Because of a hope that this is not all there is. And in Jesus, there is something much greater. Something much better. And I'll say this verse is very true. It's very true. And it's hopeful. And yet I want to also put it in perspective for a moment. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and serve a called according to his purpose. But think about that. God works all things out. It's the total effect of all things. And I just ask the question, what if God doesn't work on your timetable? What if he has a perspective that you don't have? Are we going to really sit back and when we don't understand things, are we going to give God, I'll give you a week, God. I'll give you a month. I'll give you a year. I'll give you a decade. I'll give you a lifetime. And what if God's working all things doesn't happen in that parameter of a lifetime? What do? Do you still have hope? Can you still have hope? See, if you put your hope in what Paul says, if you put your hope in the fact that God is in control, you get to rest in that. You get to rest in his control when things look hopeless, when things look broken, and when things very much look out of control. You rest in his will and not in your plans and not in your program. It is hard to hope in this world, and you may find it is very much a struggle. But there is good news. And it is good news that has endured for thousands of years. And I want to come back to that story we started at the beginning. I told you we would, and I'm coming through, okay? So Shirley and David are looking out from about 3,000 feet. And in that moment, there's no other options. David doesn't know what to do. There's no way to fix the situation. And so with the ground rapidly approaching, David does what only he can do. He realized they're both not going to make it out of this. And so he switches places with her in midair in order to take the full brunt of impact, to give her some fighting chance at making it out of that alive. And that's exactly what happens. Coming down at catastrophic speeds, he takes the full brunt of impact on his body to save her life. And she would later walk out of the hospital and she would hug her kids again. But David would never walk again. That sacrifice left him a quadriplegic, and he was just surprised to be alive. But it was that one sacrificial act of love in midair that gave Shirley a reason to hope. And I'll just say this, you may feel like this world, you may feel like your life, you may feel like your circumstances and situation are hopeless, and I will just submit this. That's exactly what they said about the cross. That is exactly what they said about the cross. Those that looked up at the cross that day were asking the same question that a lot of us ask all the time. How can anyone bring good from this? No one looked at that day with a lot of hope. His disciples, they ran away into the night, hiding, afraid for their lives, hopelessness. And Judas, the guy who betrayed, one of Jesus' followers who betrayed him, when he saw the outcome of what was going to happen to his former friend, he was ashamed. He was guilty, and he took his own life because he was so hopeless. And it was that one sacrificial act of love on the cross that when people ask, how can anyone bring good from this? Jesus took the sins and the brokenness and the frustrated groans of all of creation, of all of this hopelessness, and he put it on his shoulders, and he traded places with us. And he experienced hopelessness. He experienced death so that I would not have to. And 3 days later, and this is where the other part, this is where you look at the cross and say, who could bring good from this? Because 3 days later, he defeated death. The tomb was empty, and it still is empty. And those that looked at the cross that day, wondering what good can come from this, in time, they saw the risen Jesus, and they had reason to hope. They had confidence in a better future. And 2,000 years later, the same promise is on the table for us. It's an enduring love that never fails. And so if there's one thing, exchange all the ladders. Let all the ladders go. Spend some time this week. Figure out what those ladders are in your life. Stop climbing at the top. Let them go. And instead, I want to invite everyone to put your hope in the unfailing love of God. That's it. Want to know where this series starts? It starts with that. Put your hope on the unfailing love of God. Exchange all the confidence in your career, your marriage, your kids, the list of things that I could mention and you may be thinking. Let those go. Put your hope in the unfailing love of God. And I just want to invite you. You got to do it every day. It is so easy to start climbing and not realize till you're at the top that you've been climbing this whole time. So make that decision daily. And I'll just say this, if you are not a follower, oh my goodness, this invitation's on the table. You can do that. You can put your hope in the unfailing love of God right now in this moment, because it says to all that would receive him, all who would believe in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. Transfer your trust from all of these ladders that are falling apart and put it on the shoulders and power and love of the living God. Exercise that right. And turn to God as a loving Father. And if you're going to do this for the first time, please let somebody know. Tell someone. That's all we ask. No one should have to do this. No one should have to walk out their faith on their own. So we started this whole thing asking the question, how do I have hope in a hopelessly broken world? And I believe this is the response. If we'll put our hope in the unfailing love of God, it doesn't make the world altogether less broken. It just means that we'll be hopeful in a hopelessly broken world. And we'll be able to proclaim what Paul said at the end of this part of his letter when he encouraged people. You put your hope in the unfailing love of God. I believe this gets to be your confident statement too. Paul says, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither present nor future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And that confidence is available to you today. Put your hope in the unfailing love of God. Let's pray. Father, You know what each of us, what we're going through. You know what our lives look like. You know maybe what ladders that, we're even blind to it. You know what ladders we've put up. You know what needs to be knocked down. You know what's in the process of letting us down. And I just pray that you would help us begin to transfer that trust. Surrender those things. Make the exchanges and the choices that are necessary. Help us to put our hope in you. Groan for us, Lord. Remind us that we're your kids. And those times when everything feels dark and bleak. Thank you for your goodness, Lord. Thank you that there's no one else like you. And we pray this in your name together, Jesus. Amen.